Is it time for a mind shift? If you don't know what that means, then join your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Christian pastor and Bible college teacher of over 20 years, along the journey of deconstruction and reconstruction of faith, life, religion, and spirituality.
Hey everybody, welcome to this special bonus episode of MindShift Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Clint Haycock. What you're about to hear in a minute is actually a follow-up call, which wasn't supposed to be a follow-up. What happened was we had our normal February MindShift Zoom call scheduled, and David Johnson was a returning guest. He'd been on the show. In fact, if you've been listening, we just did an episode that came out just a Friday or so ago with him on this question of a so-called Christian defense of slavery. And this, of course, is in the larger context of my really in-depth look at controversial pastor, or some might say cult leader, Doug Wilson out of Moscow, Idaho. And we were talking about, in parts of it, we were talking about his 1996 book that he co-wrote with Stephen Wilkins, which was called Southern Slavery as It Was. And, of course, it's been sort of rebooted now. It's called Black and Tan. But this was the sort of the impetus of the conversation that led us into a lot of other places. And so what happened was, as I say, this was supposed to be the MindShift Zoom call that we do every month with returning guests, but then because there was nobody in on the call, we ended up speaking for nearly an hour on this subject, and some of the things we were able to go back around and assess and address some of the comments that I'd had on the episode. In fact, one of the comments, as you'll hear in a minute, was one person on Twitter saying something how we'd overlooked some New Testament passages. We took a long look at some Old Testament passages on slavery. We kind of touched on Paul a little bit, and Peter, and maybe some of the things Jesus said. But in this episode, what you're about to hear is me and David going into real detail on this issue of some New Testament passages, and we talk about the larger context and what's going on. Is Paul actually condoning slavery? Is he taking a stand against it? What's happening there? And so we're going to look at that in a minute. And then we talk about some other issues, Christians defending slavery, that we didn't get into in the podcast. So I really hope you enjoy this conversation with David Johnson, a bonus episode, a follow-up to our podcast the other day on a so-called Christian defense of slavery. We are recording. For some reason, we didn't have anyone drop in on this call, but that doesn't matter. David Johnson is here. He's got COVID. His video's not working, but it doesn't matter. We're going to have a great conversation anyway. So welcome, David. I'm sorry that you've got COVID. I hope you're doing okay over there.
Yeah, I think that's actually why no one dropped in the call.
Yes, just for the record.
Had COVID. Yeah. They thought, no, I don't want anything to do with it.
Not a chance. And just for the record, you cannot catch COVID on a Zoom call.
No, I hear that you can catch it on 5G.
That's true. Yeah, that's how they spread it. It's a pandemic.
Yeah.
With conspiracy theories. So just off the back of our episode that just dropped Friday, as we're doing this now on Sunday, we did an episode. I realized it was all the way back in October of 2022. I can't believe it was that many months ago that we talked about a Christian defense of slavery, which was about an hour and a half long discussion. It was an absolutely fantastic session. I don't know how you felt about it, but I really enjoyed it. And I learned a lot as well from that chat.
I always enjoy chatting with you.
Yeah, I mean, we do the research, and obviously I'm in the midst of this series on Doug Wilson. That's kind of what prompted it. I've only got 2 more episodes to do. I cannot believe I've taken such a deep dive. I've done 2+ hour episodes on him, talking about his backstory, talking about his theology, talking about the next one that's coming up is about his legacy now, because what's happening now is his sort of Christian patriarchy message. It's going into the second generation people, and so it's being spread even into some really disturbing places. Have you heard of the manosphere? Are you familiar with that, David?
No, you just dropped some knowledge on me.
Yeah, well, okay, so do you know Andrew Tate? Did you hear this? He was recently in the news being arrested in Romania.
No.
Okay, so he's kind of a leading figure in the manosphere, and it's basically an online community that's, to say that it's anti-feminist, anti-women, it would be kind of an overstatement, but this is the so-called incels, the pickup artists, all these kind of people, guys like Andrew Tate, who basically, it's a secular movement, but they're very anti-women, anti-feminist. They blame women for their problems, basically, and there's a lot to it. But what we're seeing now is Doug Wilson and some of his sort of compadres, guys that have been influenced by him, because he's probably one of the biggest leading figures in the biblical patriarchy movement. Now people are taking his message into the secular manosphere, and it's finding an audience with these incels and people like that. So some really disturbing stuff that's going on. And their argument is that they're doing it to preach the gospel, but the fact is the message resonates because they're blaming feminism for corrupting the church and, all this kind of stuff. So there's some really disturbing things. So that's the last episode that's coming out. So yeah, there's a lot of disturbing things going on.
You've got your hands in the dirty dishwater, that's for sure.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah. So that's kind of where I'm at. So this whole thing with when I wanted to speak to you was all about Doug Wilson's book that came out. It was co-authored with a guy called Stephen Wilkins, and he's another interesting figure because he's a co-founder of the League of the South. Are you familiar with the League of the South at all?
It seems I've heard of it, but I don't know enough to really become conversant about it.
Yeah, it's a neo-Confederate movement. So this guy is a pastor of a church out of Auburn Avenue, Mississippi, and now he's still in Auburn, still in Mississippi somewhere. But he was a leading figure in this sort of reviving of the neo-Confederate movement. He's an inveterate racist. He's a Presbyterian pastor. And he co-authored this book along with Doug Wilson back in 1996. And it's a Christian or biblical defense of slavery. And I've got some passages we could read. I read a couple things in our episode, I recall, that we talked about. But yeah, it was really good, I think, going into the biblical verses. In fact, that's one of the feedbacks that came out. We apparently missed a passage, David. So we're going to have to correct that for some of the listeners.
For the record, I wasn't trying to be exhaustive.
No.
I could have been there a while longer if I was making an exhaustive case. I was doing more of a survey and overview.
Yeah, it was really helpful. Do you want to hear this passage? Maybe we should deal with that first off. So somebody on Twitter responded, because I obviously tweeted out that I was coming out with this episode on Friday, and he said, well, I appreciated the discussion, but you missed a passage, because we were talking about Apostle Paul, being pro-slavery in the sense that he didn't take a stand against it. He would say things like, slaves obey your masters, masters treat your slaves well. That's the best I think you could say.
Right.
That he
wanted a happy slavery system. He didn't
yeah.
Fighting.
But this person on Twitter responded and said, you didn't talk about 1 Corinthians 7. So I've got Bible Gateway up. In fact, you know what I can do? I'll share it so people can see the passage, and you can see it here. Let's see. Share where
he's talking about women, and there's a lot of context here, and the slavery part of this is almost offhand and not actually the main point that he's making, but definitely. Let's go over it. I'm familiar with the passage.
Yeah. So, like as you say, so looking at the context of it, the kind of the gist, as you say, it's about marriage, and there's some kind of disturbing stuff about the wife doesn't have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband and so forth. The kind of key principle I get out of it is whatever state you're called to when you were a Christian, you shouldn't seek to change it. Because he says, verse 12, to the rest I say this, if any brother has a wife who is not a believer and she's willing to live with him, he must not divorce her, and she must not divorce him if he's not a Christian. And then he goes on to this thing about slavery. So here's this passage concerning change of status, verse 17 and following. He says, nevertheless, each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord has assigned to them, just as God has called them. This is the rule I lay down in all the churches. And he talks about circumcision and so forth. Then he finishes that same principle, verse 20, each person should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. Then here's the key. Verse 21, were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you, although if you can gain your freedom, do so. And I think that was the issue that the guy had with our talk. And then he says, for the one who was a slave when called to faith in the Lord is the Lord's freed person. Similarly, the one who was free when called is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of human beings. Brothers and sisters, each person is responsible to God, should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. So he repeats that principle 3 times. So what do you think of that passage then, David? Did we miss out? Because he says, if you can gain your freedom, do so. And so there's the case where Paul does take a stand against slavery.
No.
Right. So why not?
So
the short answer, no.
Yeah, the short answer, first and foremost, is this is a desperate misreading of the passage. And I'm familiar with that. I've seen Christians kind of desperately grasp at this. They want to ignore everything else, literally everything else the Bible says, and kind of grasp at this to say, you see, he didn't.
It's way to take a stand. Yeah.
Yeah, he did not take a stand, and this is not what's going on. So to unfold that a little bit deeper, in this particular passage, I am pretty sure that the slavery he is talking about is a voluntary type of indentured servitude, a debt slavery.
Right. So not the Roman sort of slave system.
Exactly. Don't sell yourself as a slave, in other words. So whatever's going on, you shouldn't sell yourself as a slave, for money and debt service.
Yeah.
So if you are free, remain free. You've got business to do. You don't have time to be voluntarily becoming someone's slave. But the slavery we see throughout the Old and New Testament, most of the time, not all the time, most of the time had to do with involuntary slavery.
Right. So chattel slavery.
Exactly. But Paul is talking about the situation of people voluntarily selling themselves into a situation to pay off debts. And he's saying, don't do that. This is a bad time to do that right now. In the same way, he's saying, if you're not married, don't get married. Don't seek to get married.
Or divorce.
Right. If you're in a crappy marriage and you've got an unbelieving spouse, don't worry about the theology of it. Stay where you are. And so when he says, for instance, if you are a slave and can't obtain your freedom, he's talking about, once again, the kind of voluntary debt slavery where you could obtain your freedom. If it's involuntary slavery, you can't obtain your freedom. You can't just ask, hey, can I leave? So this is not Paul saying, run at the first opportunity. So we can actually see, we can read the letter of Philemon and get a very full picture, or a much fuller picture, on how Paul felt about slavery. Paul didn't tell
Onesimus.
Paul didn't tell Onesimus to free Philemon. Is that right? Philemon was a slave. Onesimus.
Philemon was the master of Onesimus. So Onesimus, I think, fled to Paul,
right,
some other city, thinking, because he knew he had a relationship with Philemon, because he had led to Philemon to faith in Christ. Apparently, wasn't
this was slave Onesimus seeing an opportunity to run, and he ran and Paul said, no, you can't do that.
Yeah, you got to go back.
You got to go back. And he tells Philemon, he's not just your slave, he's your brother in Christ.
Yes, don't be harsh on him when he does come back. Because he carried the letter with him, apparently, wasn't it? He said, take this letter back and I'll smooth the waters when you do get back, so you don't get in all kinds of trouble.
But what he did not do was break that bond of slavery, of chattel servitude and ownership. And so, it's trying to treat 1 Corinthians like the way Christians are trying to treat it is a matter of desperation. I say it's really disingenuous, because in this particular case, Paul writes a whole book on this subject. So, no, this offhand mention does not cancel out the thing that Paul wrote. Now,
especially in his other epistles. Well, and this is the other argument. And I don't think we mentioned this, but I thought of this when I was listening to our conversation on the podcast, and that was that I've heard Christians say, "Well, you see, David, here's the problem: the Roman system was in effect at the time. Paul couldn't have changed it, even if he wanted to, because it was the law of the land. That Rome was in charge of the whole Roman Empire, so slavery was legal. It was the whole system on which Rome was built." The economy was built on slave labor. So therefore, even if Paul wanted to change it, he couldn't have,
Right.
So what about that?
He wasn't pushing against slavery at all, but it's not just the Romans. Slavery was legal among the Jews as well. There was nothing about their captivity that meant that they couldn't hold slaves. And, many of the parables and stories that Jesus told involved slaves and masters, at least a few there. So this is not, in fact, some kind of speech against the idea of slavery. But if you'll allow me to just take one step deeper than all of this, to kind of paint the context in a little bit more.
Well, and can I just say before you do that, one thing that strikes me about it is this verse 22. For the one who was a slave when called to faith in the Lord is the Lord's freed person. It almost seems like he's spiritualizing and he's saying, listen, if you're a slave, your status isn't going to change if you became a Christian, but somehow you're the Lord's free man or free woman, and somehow that's going to make it right. I'm still a slave. Hello.
Whatever state you find yourself in, let you therewith be content. Be content in whatever the circumstance you find yourself in. This is a Pauline idea throughout Pauline's letters, and the stuff that is kind of pseudo-Pauline, Ephesians, Timothy, and so forth, carries on this notion of being faithful to your slave masters.
He says that.
To serve them with gladness of heart. Not to try to run away. So this is, but there's a piece here in 1 Corinthians that I think that people might be missing, and I talked about this on Red Letters. Not too long ago. Patreon.com/redletters. A
shameless plug.
I'm contractually obligated to say. I wrote and signed the contract, but never mind.
Yes.
Just to back up a half a step, Jesus is what I call an imminent apocalypticist.
Mm-hmm.
This is something that I will be getting to in more detail on the show, but without going into detail there, Jesus thought that the end of all things was coming very soon.
Yeah. He said, there are those of you who will not see death until you see the Son of Man coming in his glory. And that says it all right there. There are people who are standing here who won't die before I come back.
Right. It's so the Olivet Discourse is worth reading, worth studying, and it's really hard to draw other conclusions. But I don't want to get too far down that hole. I just want to say that even before the Gospels were written, Paul was also an imminent apocalypticist. Paul also thought that the apocalypse, the end of things, was coming, and I really do believe he thought the end of all things was coming. But whether or not we're right about that, he also felt strongly that the end of life as they knew it would be coming to an end soon. And perhaps it's because of harsh relationships between the Jews and the Romans, and people at that time could sense that war was afoot, just like we do today. We feel like we can sense war afoot, when it's a few years off, because we can read the tea leaves.
Yeah.
Paul was very certain that the page was about to turn. And so this is why it's important to kind of realize this is not even about slavery. This is about marriage. And what Paul is saying about marriage is a thing that almost all Christians ignore completely. Because what they say, and rightfully so, is that Paul was talking about a special circumstance at that time. Don't get married at this time because of the current distress.
Yeah,
Now,
he says that.
no one knows what the current distress is. And he never says after the current distress, then it's okay to get married again. No. So whatever the current distress is, he may have thought that was going to be the end of all things. But he's saying, don't change your status now. It doesn't make sense. If you are married, stay married. If you're unmarried, stay unmarried. If you have lands, act as if you don't. If you are, free, act as if you were enslaved. If you were rich, act as if you were poor, because everything that you know is coming to an end. This is kind of the broader context here.
Mm-hmm.
So when he talks about this slavery, and again, I believe he's specifically talking about debt slavery, the kind of slavery that a person could voluntarily go into and out of. Don't look to go into slavery. And if you've got some business deals that tie you to this world and this system, get out of them if you can. Because nothing that you see here is going to continue as you know it today. And so this is what Paul is advising people. He is not making some political statement about slavery in as the government slavery,
taking a stand against it.
That's not what he's talking about.
Yeah.
So I just kind of wanted to bring that in for context. And I think that people who kind of desperately grasp onto this passage in 1 Corinthians, they know that, because when it comes to divorce, they say, no, we don't have to listen to that. That's not, there was a special circumstance. When it comes to this, we say, you see, Paul was against slavery and he wanted it ended forever. No, he didn't. And
there's a mountain of evidence that shows in all the other epistles said that, he says it over and over and over when he talks about the household codes, isn't it? Like husbands and wives and children and parents. And then he goes into masters and slaves. Every epistle follows a format. It's an epistolary format. So he gets into that and he says virtually the same thing in every epistle when he comes to masters and slaves. Slaves, obey your masters. Masters, treat your servants well, your slaves well. So you could at least say, well, he was trying to soften a bad system at best. Maybe he was telling masters, well, don't be so harsh on your slaves. But, like you said, even Philemon, he doesn't say, now that we're in this Christian system, you should go ahead and free Onesimus. That would be the right thing to do now, now that your brother's in Christ. He says, no, welcome him back, but just don't beat on him because he tried to escape. Because you're brothers and you owe me your very life, as he says, because I led you to the Lord. It's kind of a veiled hint, isn't it? You owe me something too. Don't forget, Philemon.
So it's not just Paul either.
Paul. You mentioned Peter says something as well, doesn't he? Or whoever's masquerading as Peter.
Right. The fool calling himself Peter. Fine. Let me pull this up real quick. I'm real slow about this. This is just my lack of preparation. It's 1 Peter 2, and I want to say 25, 19, 1 Peter 2 anyway. Let me just...
Oh, yeah, it's right here, verse 18. I'm looking at it on Bible Gateway again.
Slaves, submit to your masters with due respect, not only to those who are kind and forbearing. This is a very important piece here.
Yeah.
Because this isn't... If you understand that this is talking about slavery, and this is the real slavery, he's not just saying slavery to people who are decent folks.
Yeah. So we're looking at here. Yeah.
Yeah. Your masters do with due respect, not only to those who are kind and forbearing, but also to those who are harsh.
Mm-hmm.
It is a sign of grace if you endure the pain This again, this word is very important because we are now talking about very harsh treatment that causes pain.
Yeah.
Endure the pain of unjust suffering.
Yeah, from a harsh master.
Because of your awareness of God. And in other translations, it just says God is pleased if you can endure the pain. This does not say if you find yourself in a unjust slavery situation and they treat you harshly and the pain is too much, run like hell. There's no passage that says that. It says endure the pain in God.
Please. And Christ is the example, as Peter goes on to say, isn't it? To this you were called because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. So there's a really fucked up theology of suffering there because, and Christians even today, don't they? They've always had this issue of, suffering is almost seen as a good thing, paradoxically.
One of the Beatitudes was about suffering, the very last one. But don't leave this one too quick. Verse 23, when he was abused, did not retaliate. And what calling himself Peter is saying is, this slavery is going to involve some abuse.
Yeah.
Okay, deal with it, live with it, because in the end, God is pleased if you can endure it for his sake.
Yeah, and he's saying he didn't retaliate, he didn't make any threats when he was suffering. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. So the argument is, one day, all this will be made right. Maybe not in this lifetime, but God will be the ultimate judge. And I think you mentioned that in our podcast. You talked about in the Southern slavery system, the Black church even today has this mentality whereby they would say, well, someday, even not in this lifetime, but someday things are gonna be made right, and that's deeply, built into the DNA of even the Black church today. I mean, is that based on this kind of logic and passages like this?
Yes. Yes. And also from the Beatitudes, which I mentioned, chapter 5, Matthew, verse 10, blessed are those who are persecuted in the cause of justice, for there's the kingdom of heaven. Next one here, verse 11, blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and utter all kinds of insults against you for my sake. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward will be great in heaven. In the same manner they persecuted the prophets.
Right. Same theology.
Right. It's this theology of suffering, and suffering is good. It's this Mother Teresa kind of theology and this celebration of suffering. And if you suffer for Jesus, then he's pleased. And this is exactly the language used in 1 Peter with regard to slavery.
Yeah.
Yes, I appreciate the person calling out 1 Corinthians 7 as if we have never read this passage before.
We've studied it. We preached it. One time I preached all the way through 1 Corinthians at my church in Portland. It took like a year to do it, So I went in depth in chapter after chapter, passage after passage, So yeah, I've been there. I've done it.
I don't want to come off as a jerk. I know that this person who is saying this is probably just repeating something that he's heard someone else say, or video, read in a book, and doesn't understand the context and think that this somehow wipes out the stink of slavery in the New Testament. So I don't want to say that I know I used the word disingenuous before.
Yeah.
I don't want to insult someone who's doing their best to, this is probably a very kind-hearted person who has a very kind-hearted Jesus and a very kind-hearted Paul in mind. And so he reads these people as he would want them to have been.
And he did take a stand. Yeah.
Yeah. I just have to tell you, dear listener, that simply isn't the case.
Yeah.
That's not what that's talking about. And you can't just kind of use this out of context to erase the mountain of texts in the New Testament about this, including the whole book that Paul wrote on the subject. So,
yeah, not to mention the Old Testament, which we covered a lot of those in detail. When we come back from the break, David and I are going to get into why exactly would Christians defend slavery. This was something that kind of hit me as we did the first episode. Why in the world would any Christian want to defend slavery? And then I know of at least two answers to that question, and I'm going to throw it over onto David. And then later I'm going to play a little clip from John MacArthur, the controversial pastor, who's actually in the news right now. If you've been following anything on the Roy's Report, the website or their podcast, Julie Roy's has been doing a lot of in-depth reporting on John MacArthur, what's going on in his sort of world. And of course, if you know anything about John MacArthur, among other things, he's very much in that sort of biblical patriarchy world, right along with guys like John Piper and Doug Wilson. So he's another one to kind of keep an eye out on. So I'm going to play a clip from him. Believe it or not, he's going to defend slavery. So it's not just Doug Wilson. It's far from an isolated case. And of course, I don't mention that in this podcast, but the real concern with Doug Wilson is that his teachings have gone far and wide into the Christian homeschooling movement. So you've got a whole couple of generations now, really, of kids who have been raised with Doug Wilson's views on Southern slavery, a sort of a revisionist, racist view of history of Christian defense of slavery. So it's not just an isolated thing. He has a massive reach into the classical Christian schools, the Christian homeschooling movement. So this is a real concern. This is not just something that I'm making up by any stretch of the imagination. So after this bonus episode, what's going to happen? If you've been following the series on Doug Wilson, try to hang with me. We're nearly finished with it. We're going to do 2 more episodes. The next one that's coming out is an interview that I did a while back with Dr. Nick Geyer. And he, of course, was Doug Wilson's professor back in the 1970s at the University of Idaho. He taught philosophy there. Something I pointed out in one of the episodes, might have been the first one. Doug Wilson actually has no formal theological training. He's never been to Bible college, never been to seminary. He's done a master's degree in philosophy at the U of Idaho. And, of course, over the decades, really, Dr. Geyer has kind of opposed Doug Wilson. He lives in that area, the Moscow, Idaho area. And so he's written a lot of things on various websites and blogs about Doug Wilson, exposing a lot of the stuff that he's done over the years. Really, a lot of it's behind the scenes. So Dr. Geyer is a valuable resource. He's not just someone who remembers him from classes in 1977. This is a guy who's worked for years to expose Doug Wilson right in the Moscow area. And then the final episode we're going to do is another sort of a long-form look at the legacy of Doug Wilson. What's happening now is you've got sort of second, third generation pastors who've been influenced by Doug Wilson in one way or another. They're associates of Doug Wilson. They've written books on his Canon Press website and other things. And they're now taking his sort of biblical or Christian patriarchy message into what's called the manosphere, which David and I get into in this episode as well. We talked about that a little bit at the beginning. This is a real concern because his message is finding a home in a very toxic, sort of anti-women, anti-feminist, very misogynistic world of the manosphere. So this is a major, major concern. This is just one of the toxic legacies of Doug Wilson. So that's going to be the last episode. And I think I mentioned this before. I've got enough material. If people want me to do an in-depth dive into Doug Wilson and Wilkins's book, Southern Slavery as It Was, which of course we've touched on in this episode and the last one with David Johnson, I could do a complete standalone episode on a theological war thesis. What is it? What's the backstory behind not just the book, Southern Slavery as It Was, but the connections to R.J. Rushdoony, the founder of Christian Reconstructionism. There's a whole nother story to this whole issue. This is not just the book by any stretch of the imagination. It's actually quite a disturbing thing, which is kind of part and parcel of what's called the neo-Confederate movement. So there's a lot of stuff that's gone on, much more so than this book. So if you want me to do that, you can reach out to me. And there's a couple of different ways you can do that. One way to do that would be just to send me a DM on Twitter. You can follow me there at MindShift 2018. Send me a message there or tweet something over to me. The other way is to look up my public Facebook page, the MindShift Podcast Facebook page. You can send a message, there's a little button you can click, send an email there, and I'll get that. In fact, a lot of you have written to me in the last couple of months about my series on Doug Wilson, so I really appreciate that. If you have any thoughts, questions, comments on anything related to Doug Wilson or anything related to cults or whatever, send me a message there through the MindShift Podcast public Facebook page. And then, of course, you can always support the show. That helps me to keep doing what I'm doing. It kind of defrays some of the expenses that I've got every month to keep bringing you this show. You can become a Patreon supporter of the show. And as always, the links to that are in the show notes. We've got, in fact, speaking of supporters, you're going to get access to next month's MindShift Zoom call with Sam Terode. He's got a lot of interesting stuff to talk about. So we're going to have Sam on in the month of March. And then I think in the month of April, we're going to have Elgin Strait. And he's a former Moonie. I'm going to be talking to him actually coming up very soon. I'm also going to be talking to Benny Kocius. She's another cult survivor. So there's some really interesting interviews coming up. In fact, I had a conversation just the other day with Nathaniel Manderson. He writes a lot on Salon. He's a liberal Christian. In fact, he and I ended up having a lot in common. We found out we went to the same seminary together in New England. So that was a kind of a surprising connection to make. So again, look for that conversation coming up with Nate Manderson. And then finally, I've been chatting with Heather Hamilton. She's just come out with a book called Returning to Eden, and this is hitting it big on Amazon right now. So we're going to be having a chat with Heather at some point coming up too. So some really cool content coming down the road here on MindShift Podcast. Anyway, let's get back into the second half of this chat with David Johnson as we continue to take a look at this follow-up conversation to a Christian defense of slavery. This is my question now. Why, I don't think I asked you this in the podcast, but why do Christians defend slavery? Because I think there's at least two reasons I can think of. Maybe you have some other ones, but for Doug Wilson and Wilkins, the answer is really to do with defending the inerrancy of the Bible. And I think I mentioned this in the podcast. I read a little section from their book, and they argue that you cannot allow any crack to appear in the inerrancy argument of the Bible. And therefore, because the Bible condones slavery in the Old and New Testament, they are therefore forced to defend it and say that Southern slavery was actually a mutually beneficial thing, that the only criticism you could level against Southern slavery was that it wasn't 100% biblical, in air quotes. And that was one of the things that led to the South being judged by God. And then there's the other argument, which I'd mentioned, David Barton, the Wall Builders, the Christian nationalist piece, and that is they have to defend slavery because their argument is that because America was a Christian nation, how could God bless America if slavery was an evil thing? And they will turn around and say, well, it wasn't evil. And that's why God was able to bless America the way he did. Therefore, America is and always was a Christian nation and should be one again. So those are two arguments. You could say, well, I understand why Christians would feel the need to defend slavery. Have you heard any more along those lines that might be different?
Well, so I let me just say in full agreement, yes, there's a certain kind of Christian that has to defend slavery.
Yeah, you're forced, really.
Right, because as they understand the Bible defends slavery. And therefore, a true Christian must defend slavery. They cannot blush at
So, warts and all, they have to defend it.
Right. But it's also fair that we acknowledge the other type of Christian. So, for instance, our 1 Corinthians 7 commenter would represent the other type of Christian. And they kind of come at this from a different angle. And their angle is because slavery is wrong, then God never defended slavery.
Right.
And so you have to go through the Bible where all of that slavery stuff is and explain it away somehow. And you have to explain it away faithfully and carefully and thoroughly. And you can't leave cracks in that armor. Otherwise, you would have God condoning slavery. And so they also feel forced. And so it really depends at which side of this you're coming from.
Mm-hmm.
The Bible is true, and God condones slavery, then they're forced to say slavery is therefore good. And if they're coming at it from the perspective of slavery is bad, and therefore the Bible actually cannot be condoning slavery.
Right. You have to explain it away then. So it's the opposite. It's the opposite problem that they got. That's so funny.
In each case, they are both complete. Their hand is already dealt for them, and they just have to play it.
Yeah, and I think the David Barton article on the Wall Builders website, he goes down some of that line, and this is what R.J. Rushdoony, the founder of Christian Reconstructionism, part of his earlier argument is that, well, what you're seeing in the Bible, when it says slavery, it's not really slavery. Not like we think of it, in human chattel terms and things like that. And he goes through an exhaustive detail that breaks down all these different kind of categories, and it's not as bad as as you think it was. And so he's kind of going down that line as well, like you just articulated. He's explaining a lot of it away. It's not as bad, it's not as severe as it sounds when you read the word slavery. Don't think of slavery like we think of, It was more like indentured servants, and I think we talked about that in the podcast.
Well, and there was indentured servitude.
Yeah, so, it was a thing.
Let's be clear about that. Indentured servitude was a part of the economic structure.
Yeah,
and it wasn't the same as slavery. But to be clear, in again, I didn't look at my references. I want to say Leviticus 25. Either that or Deuteronomy 25.
Yeah, the passages we looked at.
Right. So in that passage, it actually makes a distinction between the two types of servitude.
Yeah.
And it distinguishes, on the one hand, don't treat your Jewish brothers as slaves, as chattel that you own.
Right.
But rather treat them as employees. This is very explicit. But of these slaves that are not your Jewish brothers, those you can treat as chattel.
You can pass them along to your children, and they're your slaves for forever, basically.
For life.
Exactly. And the Jews had to be released every 7 years at the year of Jubilee, which was a literal escape clause that a foreigner wouldn't have had in that system.
Right. And if I recall correctly, it was even sweeter than that for the Jews, because the Jubilee was every 7 years, but it was a set 7 years.
Right.
So if you sold yourself into slavery for some great debt in year 6.5,
you only served 6 months.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it really was an economic system, but the Bible distinguishes that from the other slavery that it's talking about. And so when Christians try to say, oh, well, the slavery, it wasn't that bad, I think they're ignoring the fact that there was the two systems of slavery, and they just would like to conflate it, and make the bad slavery go away. And you can't do that. The thing that when I've debated Christians on this, I just asked them something a lot simpler. I step away from the theology. Would you want your child currently to be under your idea, whatever your idea is, of the biblical form of slavery? Yes or no? It's always no.
That ends the debate right there then and there, isn't it?
Right.
I think you said something like even the best slave system, that you could possibly imagine. I wouldn't want my daughters in that system,
Right. And I mean, I wish I hadn't mentioned daughters, because yes, we could talk about female slavery.
Yeah, we talked about that on the show. It's different rules for women.
Yeah, it's bad. It's exactly what you think it is. So,
they're not released on the 7th year of Jubilee, and there's all these clauses for the women that don't apply to the men.
Yeah, there's marriage and or sex, and stuff. It is what you think it is.
Yeah.
And we don't need to go into that. But you asked me, why I thought that people felt the need to defend slavery. And there is also, I should mention, a third branch of Christianity that doesn't feel the need to defend slavery at all, and that would be the progressive Christian.
Yeah.
The progressive Christian would simply read all of that stuff about slavery, and they would acknowledge that slavery went on in the name of God, but they would say that those people actually misunderstood God's will, and they were attributing falsely to God the commands about slavery. So,
right.
Their God is a very progressive God, and God didn't, go in and destroy them and force them to change all of their terrible social structures, but He revealed gradually over thousands of years how He really wanted people to live, and so
progressive revelation in a way. Yeah.
So they would not be forced to defend slavery, and they're not even explaining it away by redefining slavery. They would say, yeah, it actually absolutely did happen exactly the way you read it. It's just that all of those passages that say, "Thus saith the Lord," were not really the Lord. And it was their misapprehension of what the Lord wanted.
Yeah, I think a similar argument could be made for the passages that describe God commanding the Israelites to commit genocide in the Old Testament. Wouldn't you say the same thing? You could say, well, it wasn't really God who commanded them to commit. It was man, basically humanity, twisting what they thought was the word of God, or they just said, "Oh, God told me that we have to kill them all." So that's what ended up being written in the text, was that God commanded, but it wasn't really God. God would never do that. He would never command slavery. He would never command genocide. He's a loving, merciful, kind, and forgiving God. That's the God we want to worship on a Sunday morning in church. We don't want to worship the angry God of the Old Testament. We don't want that God.
Well, I'll tell you who you should bring on your show for a good chat if you're up to it. Randall Rouser. He's a proponent of this type of
Randall
teaching, and he's a friend of mine. I love him. We agree about nothing.
Yes, I've had to go around with Randall once before.
He's fun to talk to. He likes a fair fight.
I think I don't know if I mentioned this, but he and I got into it one time in a Twitter war a couple of years ago over this issue of genocide, the Old Testament, and I actually wrote a paper for his blog that he then wrote a rebuttal to, and then I wrote a rebuttal to his rebuttal, and went back and forth about 5 or 6 times, and then I finally just gave up because it was pointless. So I know who Randall Rouser is. He's actually a professor at some seminary in Canada, I think, or he was when I was dealing with him.
He's still a working professor.
Yeah, it's like he's a theologian in some Canadian seminary. And I thought he was basically treated me like a troll. I didn't know who he was. He was basically trolling me. And I was, I said some tweet about God commanding genocide and all that, and he jumped all over it. So yeah, we had a few interactions a few years ago, but
you can't let that taint your opinion of Randall too much. My first engagement with Randall Rouser was on the show Unbelievable with Justin, and the knives came out, but that's how the show is, and that's how Randall is.
Combative.
Conversation is a blood sport. So arm up. But at the show, we had lots of other conversations. He came onto my show. We've had plenty of good engagement. He's actually a very nice guy, until he steps in the ring.
Right. The knives come out.
Yeah, but that's just the game.
Yeah.
So I can tell you now, if Randall had several rounds of papers with you on his site, it's because he likes you.
I feel so much better, David.
Are you good? Not the like giving you the thumbs up. You can't see.
I can't see it, but I got one more thing. This is something I wanted to play on our discussion last October. We just didn't have time to get into it. If you permit me an indulgence in the last few minutes, I've got a clip to play for you from John MacArthur. This is really interesting. If you want to take a minute, and I'll show you this. This is really interesting.
It's John MacArthur.
John MacArthur. So if hopefully you can see that. This is a clip from 10 years ago. John MacArthur on the subject of slavery and true liberty. Now, I wonder where this falls in our discussion in terms of why he's defending slavery as he feels he needs to here. So, and hit play. It's only a couple minutes long.
It is a little strange that we have such an aversion to slavery because historically there have been abuses. There have been abuses in marriage. We don't have an aversion to marriage particularly because there have been abuses. There are parents who abuse their children. We don't have an aversion to having children because some parents have been abusive. Of course, it can have any kind of situation where abuse can be involved. The reason unions grew up in America was not to free slaves. The reason unions grew up in America was because there were people who had businesses and they were abusing their employees. So to throw out slavery as a concept simply because there have been abuses, I think, is to miss the point. In any kind of human relationship, there can be abuses. There can also be benefits. For many people, poor people, perhaps people who weren't educated, perhaps people who had no other opportunity, working for a gentle, caring, loving master was the best of all possible worlds. If you had the right master, everything was taken care of. So we have to go back and take a more honest look at slavery and understand that God has, in a sense, legitimized it when it's handled correctly by saying this is the way you're to view your relationship to Jesus Christ, the perfect, all-wise, all-loving, all-compassionate, all-beneficent Lord, and you willing to be his slave because of such unique care provided by him.
So he goes on and talks about the Christian slavery, like being a slave to Christ, but I mean, that's the gist of the recording. What do you think of that then, David? I mean, where does he fall in the spectrum of defending slavery from a Christian point of view?
Yeah, well, he has no choice because he reads the Bible.
Yeah, he's an inerrantist.
I read the Bible, and God condones slavery, and so he has to defend it, and he just has to tell himself that it's a kinder, gentler slavery. Let me just say this about the first part of what he said. I completely agree with that. I think that if your logic is slavery is bad because there are abuses, it's faulty logic. It's true that slavery certainly invites abuses. Sure. And in fact, some things, some systems invite more abuses than others. They're inherently abuse magnets, and I think that slavery would be one of those things. But I take his point. Philosophically, you can't condemn a thing simply because it is possible to abuse the thing. It's possible to abuse kitchen knives and use them as murder weapons, but we need kitchen knives, very sharp kitchen knives, to do good chef work. So on that point, I agree with him. I think his point is pretty much irrelevant, though, because I don't think that's what anyone is saying. So I don't think that people are saying, well, slavery is bad because it can be abused.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of a straw man argument that he's making, because no one is actually making the opposite argument.
That assertion,
right? At least no one who we should pay any attention to.
Yeah. Well, and he makes that point. I think you talked about it in the podcast, that the counter argument is what he says, that, hey, if you're poor and you're uneducated and down and out, that's actually the best thing you could hope for, to be a slave. If you had a good master, it was really beneficial for you. As you mentioned that it's uplifting to these poor people, so.
Okay. This is where his argument really starts, as far as I'm concerned, and it's all bad. So let me. This is the first time I've heard this, so I'm kind of coming off the top of my head. But let me just try an analogy or two here. You can say that prostitution is really good for some women, because otherwise they have not enough education. They're down and out. They are homeless, and the system of prostitution gives them work that they can do. They get paid reasonable money, and as long as they have good pimps, good loving pimps, this is a good life for them. We can try that with any number of things, I think, but I think what he is missing here is that there are some things that are, and this is kind of what I was hinting at before, that are by nature exploitative.
Some systems, yeah.
And there are reasons why we push against it. So sex work, this is a thing where I haven't fully thought out all of my opinions. I guess I am glad it exists, because it can be a source of freedom for some people if that is how you are oriented. I can easily see the benefits of sex work, but the thing that keeps me from offering a full-throated endorsement is that it is inherently exploitative. So there is no way to do it well, in my opinion. And this is where, if someone wants to change my mind on that, this is where they would argue. They could say, well, women are actually just as much managers in this business as men, and women have a lot of control over their bodies and their circumstances, and
some do.
This can be done, in fact, without exploitation, as I am suggesting it, and I'm willing to hear that argument. But I know for a lot of women who go into sex work, because I've done street ministries and homeless ministries, inner city ministries is what I'm trying to get after. Those women are not self-possessed. Those women are not, in fact, in possession of themselves and making good choices. Those women are freaking desperate.
Yeah, they're being exploited.
And that's right. And sure, voluntarily, but they have no choice. And they're, rather than men offering them a step up in a system that could offer them education and food and shelter, they say, well, I tell you what, since you're desperate, I'll exploit your body. And so I think it is inherently exploitative. They get hooked on drugs, and there's just
controlled by pimps and all that. Yeah.
And after a while, there is this lifestyle is the only lifestyle.
Yeah.
That they can do, that they can see themselves doing, and it's too late.
Yeah, they're trapped in it.
In order for a thing to be free will, a free will decision, actually have to have options, right? So if you are, in a train going down a track, you don't have the option to go left or right. You're on a freaking track.
Yeah.
Right.
One-way destination. Yeah.
Right. So you can say, well, I have the option to get on the train, but I didn't know where the train was going. And now that I'm going, I'd like to get off. I'd like to stop the train. I'd like to go left. No, you're on a track.
Yeah, no choice.
So for your option to be true, these women have to have life options. And then they choose out of those options that they understand and that are truly accessible for them. And in my experience in inner city ministries, I imagine you've had experience like this too.
Yeah,
they don't have those options.
Yeah.
So I use this analogy to come back to slavery. In slavery situations, you're dealing with people who did not have options. Okay,
Yeah.
when even in indentured servitude, this was an inherently exploitative system, which, by the way, is why we don't have it today. You just kind of need to ask yourself, why does no government do this today? We understand it is inherently exploitative. This is a person who has gotten into debt.
Yes.
They have no means to pay it back. They don't have a job. Their family is starving. And then someone comes along and says, well, I tell you what you can do. You can be my slave. And they say, okay, I'll take it.
Yeah.
Because they don't have any options. So this is kind of the problem with this person's entire argument. For the right person, slavery is good. Actually, you're just exploiting a person in a bad situation.
Yeah.
And if it was your son that you were talking about, you wouldn't think he was the right person for slavery. You would sell your goddamn house and help him get out of debt so that he doesn't have to be someone's slave. That's what...
Whatever you could, yeah.
Right. You wouldn't sit there and just blithely say, well, have you considered selling yourself into slavery?
Yeah.
Right. Hey, daughter, have you considered selling yourself into slavery? There's an option for you.
Yeah.
No one would do that because they understand that it is inherently exploitative. And when people that they love find themselves in situations where they have no options, they come to rescue them, not to exploit them.
Yes.
Slavery is a system that offers a solution of exploitation.
Yeah, and you can see that. I mentioned in our podcast, reading through Frederick Douglass's autobiography, as well as 30 Years a Slave by Lewis Hughes. I mean, these two men were born into the slave system, grew up in it, and both escaped the system, and reflected on it while they were slaves, and then again after, when they were free in the North. And it did, like you say, it gives the lie to that argument that, well, it was actually pretty good, and it was a mutually beneficial system, and all the rest of it. Why did they keep trying to escape? If it was such a great system, and get brutally flogged and beaten for it every time they got caught. It wasn't just a one-off thing. They tried multiple times and failed, and got beaten badly as a result of it and punished, so, and yet they kept trying until they succeeded, so it does give the lie to that story. Well, I was going to say, it's been about an hour now. We've chatted. Unfortunately, no one was able to drop in on this call, but I've still had a great time. I don't know about you. I know you got COVID. So you're going to have to go rest up a bit now.
Part of my day. So
yeah.
You'll after this conversation.
That's right. This is the highlight then. Okay. Well, thank you so much, David. I was going to say, at some point we're going to do are we doing the Skeptics and Seekers Sunday sermon? I'm still looking forward to that.
You signed the bottom line. There are no options. There's no escape clause.
Okay. I'm in.
You're the first one in the month. We missed you this time because we had a guest and the guest didn't show up.
Oh.
And so I actually had to do a different show. I didn't call you at the last minute because
you could have. I probably would have dropped in.
I didn't want to make you feel exploited.
I would love to. I would love to be a part of it. So if you ever get stuck, just give me a shout. I'm probably free. Since I moved in with my girlfriend, I've had a lot more time, because if I was home alone, I'd be probably working on my podcast anyway. But I'm trying to balance things out here, so
we can merge your few. These, I can tell you, the others of the four have been stellar.
Okay, good.
They have been stellar, and so you're gonna have to bring your A game.
No pressure.
No pressure.
Yeah, but remember, I don't
want your first show on SNS to be the letdown.
I did do a PhD on preaching and homiletics, so I've got that going for me. I've studied sermons, I've studied preaching, historically and all that. So I hope I got something to bring to the table.
Oh, you do.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, David. I hope you feel better soon. I've had COVID. It's no fun, but maybe about a week you'll be right as rain, as they say.
I'll tell you the worst part of it right now, and it sounds so trivial, but I cannot smell or taste. I can't taste. Everything tastes like garbage.
Yeah. You're just eating because you know you have to eat and drink, but you're not
And I
enjoying
can't eat that much because it's just so unpleasant.
Yeah. I didn't have that when I had it. I must have had a milder case, but I could taste everything, but I just kept testing positive for about 7 or 8 days. Then it finally came up. I just felt like I had kind of a flu and just stayed home from work. And that was it for me for about a week. So it wasn't too bad. And then I think I'm okay. But thank you so much. Let me know when you need me for this new episode of Sunday Sermons, and we'll definitely stay in touch. Thank you, David. Hope you'll feel better, and we'll speak to you again.
All right. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye. See you soon.